Some years ago, I was at a wedding reception, truly elegant and beautiful. Attending this wedding party were a number of friends and acquaintances from our church parish. I knew some folks and others I met for the first time, but all of us were pretty engaged in our parish life. In a lively discussion on the state of our world, politics, and how we care for the poor, I shared my dismay over government policies that seemed to go counter to our Christian Catholic values. When I asked the question that was popularized on plastic bracelets at the time, what would Jesus do? I will never forget this gentleman's response because it took my breath away. That is irrelevant, he said. I said, do you mean Jesus is irrelevant? His teachings irrelevant? The response was, yes. Quote, you can't use Jesus in American politics, unquote. It was a moment that rendered me speechless. And for anyone who knows me, that is saying something. I really didn't want to shame him, and I also knew that after he said it, he himself tried to explain, but it hung in the air. For many of us at that table were in class together working on our master's in theology at the time, including this gentleman. So the topic was quickly dropped. Now I need to tell you, and this is important, that this was well over 15 years ago. It was not in the political climate of our day today. I'm afraid we wouldn't even dare discuss anything about our government and politics at a wedding today. But when I was praying with this passage and Greg Boyle's beautiful insight into what compassion looks like, I remembered this moment. How do we walk with the excluded today in a world where the gap between those of wealth and poverty is growing larger? Who are the ones we are standing with, supporting, befriending? Who are the ones we invite to the table of plenty? It feels like fewer and fewer can make it these days. In this section of Luke, Jesus is sharing stories and teachings of humility, reminding that we should be thinking less of ourselves and more of the entire community. This community, the disciples and those of us who follow them, will eventually understand as the body of Christ. We have the good fortune of hindsight. We have saints and prophets who have helped us see throughout time the face of Jesus and those around us, should we forget. So how can Jesus be irrelevant? I feel like we know his words to be true from our own experiences. When he tells us to invite those who can't do anything for us, that we will be repaid at the resurrection of righteousness, we know from experience that it is indeed in the giving that we receive. As our blessed St. Francis Peace Prayer reminds us, we know that when we reach beyond our comfort zones and reach to those in need, we are richly blessed in this life. And Jesus says, and will be repaid also at the resurrection as well. So to emphasize the point, Jesus goes on to share the story of a great dinner party prepared for some guests who are clearly of means, I believe. When the party is ready, the invited all made excuses and turned down the invitation. I think it is interesting to note that they were all distracted by their consumer lives, one might say, from buying land, yoke, and oxen, and even being recently married, which was a bartered reality in its day. These were all people of means who were too distracted, too caught up in their material lives to accept a gracious invitation. Instead, the host gathers all those who would otherwise be left behind: the unclean, the poor, the lame, the abandoned, the ill, the misfits. Basically, he raises up those that society would never dine with. And by doing so, the generous host becomes one with his guests. Can you imagine the story being shared at the time? How shocking to the Pharisees, who were also listening to Jesus very intently, because, they so wanted Jesus to be irrelevant. Jesuit Greg Boyle drives this message all the way home when he reminds us to stand in awe of what our poor brothers and sisters have to carry in this world. So many born into circumstances that they had no choice in. Greg is the founder of Homeboy Industries, the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. He sees Jesus' way of loving as very relevant, and he and his community are committed to not just serve the poor, but to be with them, dine with them, live with them, advocate for them. And as he points out, Jesus was not a man for others, he was one with them. It is perhaps more important now than ever before for us to pay attention to our world, our neighbors who are struggling. We need to pay attention to all the ways we can be one with them. And sometimes that does mean how we govern. How do our policies affect the least of our brothers and sisters? And whose pockets are being filled at the cost of others? We simply need to pay attention and listen to Jesus in our hearts. So the question for me remains, do we Christians believe in Jesus? And if our answer is yes, and then I would imagine his message would be relevant in our world today. God, I do hope so. Have a blessed day.